This presentation is brought to you by the District Court of the 2nd Judicial District of the State of New Mexico. Judge Ann Cass, the presiding judge of the Family Court Division, will describe for you the realities of divorce and the terrible consequences that children can suffer if their divorced parents fight. The solution Judge Cass will propose is mediation.
Hello, and welcome to Mediation. I'm going to talk to you today about fairy tales and fantasies, and I'm going to talk to you about statistics and reality. And I hope when I've finished that you will agree with me that mediation is a very important part of your divorce process. I'm sure all of you have heard the fairy tales about the handsome prince and the beautiful princess who got married and lived happily ever after. And I'm sure all of you know that those were fairy tales. There's a new fairy tale, and that new fairy tale has a handsome prince and beautiful princess getting divorced and living happily ever after. That's a bigger fairy tale. I think that one of the first pieces of reality that all of you need to know is that divorce is not a quick fix. Divorce does not make everything all better. As a matter of fact, there are some things that divorce makes worse. And one of the things that divorce makes worse for every couple that I have ever seen is money problems. And when you think about that, it's pretty obvious why that happens, because when you divorce, you create two households where there once was one, and you double your housing expense, you double utility expenses, you double medical insurance expenses. And all of your other expenses increase if they don't double. And for most divorcing families, your income does not increase. And of course, when you increase expenses without increasing income, that typically spells financial hardship. For some families, it spells out and out financial disaster. I've come to realize that one unavoidable consequence of divorce is that you must adjust your standards of living downward. And that's very hard to do. But it's important for you to know that if not having enough money is one of your problems, there isn't a judge in the whole world who can fix it. And the problem of not having enough money is a problem that lawyers tend to make worse, not better. I think another piece of reality that all of you need to know is that our statistics tell us that within 3 years of your divorce, many of you will have married a second time. I say that to people in my court who are being divorced, and I often see them shaking their heads and saying, "Not me, I know better." But the statistics don't bear you out. The statistics tell us that you will marry a second time. The statistics also tell us that 70% of second marriages involving stepchildren, and all of your second marriages will involve stepchildren because your own children become someone's stepchildren. 70% of those second marriages fail. It's a staggering statistic. And they fail for a number of reasons, one of which is ongoing money problems. But another reason so many of them fail is because your lives get so complicated. You end up very often with your children, my children, and our children. You have more grandparents than you're ever going to know what to do with. And just trying to figure out how to share a holiday becomes a major event. Your lives get complicated, and when your lives get complicated, you get stressed. And when you get stressed, conflict has a way of coming along right behind. And it's conflict, unresolved conflict, that destroys relationships. So please don't expect that when a judge signs that piece of paper called a final decree of divorce, that everything's going to be just fine. Because if that's what you expect, you're going to be disappointed. That's not the way it works. As I said, divorce is not a cure-all. And I urge those of you who still have an opportunity to do so to give it a second thought. Now, I said I would talk about fairy tales and fantasies. I think a common fantasy that a lot of divorcing people have, it's sort of a hope in their heart of hearts, and that is that the other parent will just disappear, just go away. I learned about that fantasy back in 1980 when I was a lawyer and I was representing a father who wanted custody of his then 5-year-old son. Now, it was 1980, and we didn't have a mediation program. We didn't even have a family court, so we had to do it the old-fashioned way. And the old-fashioned way was this. He and I went out and hired a psychologist. And our psychologist talked to both parents and the child and came back and said, "These are both pretty good parents, but the father's a little better. He should have custody." And the mother and her lawyer, well, they went out and hired a different psychologist. And the second psychologist interviewed everyone and came back and said, "Yes, these are both pretty good parents, but the mother's a little better. She should have custody." And off to court we went. We spent 2 days in trial. And during those 2 days, those two parents said just awful things about each other, just awful. Now, that's what happens in courtrooms. The language of law is fault and blame. Now, after listening to these two people say terrible things about each other for 2 days, the judge said, "This is a hard decision for me to have to make. You both love your son, and he loves both of you. My decision is this. The mother will have custody, and the father will have visitation. The father's visitation will be 3 weekends out of every month, Wednesday overnight every week, all summer long every summer, and half the holidays." I will never forget the look of pain on my client's face. He felt that he had been changed from a parent into a visitor. He felt that he had lost everything. I took him into the halls of the courthouse and sat with him on a bench to try to console him. He was in tears. And as we were sitting on the bench, I happened to look up, and there, sitting a few feet away from us, were the mother and her lawyer. And I was surprised to see that the mother was just as upset as the father was. And I thought to myself, goodness me, what's wrong with her? She just won. What's her problem? And as I thought about it days after that trial, it dawned on me what her problem was. She'd gone to court with a fantasy. She thought that she would get custody and he would go away. She thought that custody meant she would never have to deal with him again. And when she discovered that she was going to have to deal with him day in and day out for years, well, she didn't feel as though she had won anything. And the more I thought about it, I realized that my very own client, the father, had gone to court with that same fantasy. That's what he thought was going to happen, except the other way around. He'd get custody and she'd go away. Now, it was 1980, and those two parents spent $15,000. And by today's standards, that's very inexpensive. Today, custody suits cost $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000. They're astonishingly expensive. But those two parents spent $15,000 to learn the lesson that they were going to have to share their son's life. And one of the reasons that we have you in mediation is we want to help you learn that before you spend thousands of dollars instead of after. That's one of our goals for you. Now, I said that having a parent disappear, for one of the parents to disappear, is a fantasy, a fairy tale, that it doesn't happen. That's not quite true, because sometimes it does happen. And I'd like to tell you about a case that was in my court in which it did happen. Here's the way it went. The parents were being divorced here in Albuquerque 14 years earlier. They had a 1-year-old daughter. And they were fighting about how much time Dad ought to spend with this little girl. Now, somewhere in the middle of the fight, the mother got tired of it all, and she moved to Nevada and filed a second divorce suit. You could do that back then. The mother filed the second suit, had the father served with papers here in Albuquerque, and he apparently was tired of the fight too, because he just ignored the papers. He didn't do anything. Don't do that with court papers. But that's what he did. And so when the time had passed in Nevada, the Nevada judge signed a divorce decree that had been prepared by the mother's Nevada lawyer. And that divorce decree provided that the mother would have sole custody and the father would have absolutely no visitation at all, none. The decree also provided that the father did not have to pay any child support. I guess the mother's Nevada lawyer thought that no time, no money was a fair deal. So the judge signed that decree, and that's what happened. Now, what brought that case back to my court 14 years later, when the little girl was 15, was the fact that in her 15th year, the little girl attempted suicide. And the psychologist who was treating her explained to us that the major contributing factor to that little girl's suicide attempt was her intense longing to know her father. I'm sure most of you have heard about adopted children who reach the age of 18 and just move heaven and earth to find their birth parents. Children want to know their parents. The psychologist told us that the little girl had always thought to herself, everybody's daddy loves them except my daddy. My daddy doesn't love me. I must be unlovable. She blamed herself. And he said that children who lose a parent through divorce always feel that way. They always feel it's their fault. And no matter how many times and how many people say to them, it's not your fault, they still feel that it is. He said the little girl had always had a fantasy, which was every time something unhappy happened in her life, she thought to herself, if only my daddy were here. If my daddy were here, this bad thing wouldn't have happened. Now that's not so, but that's what she thought. And when she turned 15, it got to be more than she could bear, and she attempted suicide. The psychologist told us that what it was going to take to make that little girl whole and healthy again was we were going to have to find her father. And the mother was back in my court 14 years after she had won it all, because she discovered that her victory had been her daughter's loss. And she came back to my court to ask the court to help her try to find the father, because he really had disappeared. Now, we haven't any way to find missing parents. And the irony in that case is that mother is now spending her own money to pay a private investigator to try to find the father. And that mother has learned a lesson at a terrible cost to her daughter. And the lesson is this: a child's needs and a parent's needs are often different. You know, it might be best for the two of you to never see each other again. That might be best for you. But that's not what's best for your children. Your children need and love both of you. And we hope to help you learn that. And we hope to help you learn that your children's needs can be different from yours. And we hope to convince you that when they are, your children's needs will come first. That's another one of our goals for you. Now, I said I would talk about statistics. We have a lot of statistics, but some of the most reliable that we have tell us that there are two factors. If these two factors exist in the lives of children of divorced parents, then we can predict with terrible, terrible certainty that the children will suffer severe long-term problems. Now, I'm talking about failure in school. I'm talking about juvenile delinquency problems that lead to adult criminal problems. I'm talking about drug and alcohol abuse. I'm talking about severe, life-threatening problems. And here's what the two factors are. The first, not enough money. A downward adjustment in their standard of living. Now, I told you that's very difficult for you, but it's more difficult for your children. And I also just told you that that was going to happen to almost all of you, and that no one could do very much about it. Now, the second factor is conflict. Unresolved conflict. conflict between the parents, those two most important people in the children's lives. Now, the second factor, conflict, that one can be fixed. But it's important for you to know that there's only two people in the whole world who have the power to fix it. There's only two people in the whole world who can stop the fight, and that's the two of you. Judges can't stop the fight. Lawyers can't stop the fight. They often make it worse. Only the two of you can stop the conflict. And when I'm talking about conflict, I'm not talking about violence. Everyone knows violence is awful. But the kind of conflict that we see the most of, the conflict that destroys children, are those little nasty things you do and say. For example, the children are to be ready to go with one of their parents at 5 o'clock, and they're not ready until 6. Or the children are to be returned at 7 o'clock, but they don't show up until 9. Or the child support is due on the 5th of the month, but it doesn't get there till the 20th. Those little mean things you say about one another. That's the kind of conflict that destroys children. I'm sure all of you have heard it said that when divorced parents fight, it's the children who get hurt. I want to tell you about a case that was in my court that brought home for me what that can mean. It was a case involving two parents with a 14-year-old daughter, and they were being divorced. It was a bitter divorce. And the final decree ultimately provided that the little girl would live mostly with her mother and spend some time with her father, and the father would pay child support. It was a pretty routine arrangement. Now, a few months after the divorce was over, and we really shouldn't use the word over because it's never over, but a few months after the divorce decree had been signed, mother and daughter got into a quarrel, and the daughter packed up her things in anger and moved across town to Dad's house. Now, instead of getting on the phone and saying, "Hey, Mom, we've got a problem, we better talk," the father opened the door and said to her, "Come on in. I always told you your mother was no good." And a few weeks later, he was in my court and said, "She lives with me now, so stop the support." Well, a few months passed. Father and daughter got into a quarrel. And the daughter packed up her things in anger again and moved across town to Mom's house. And Mom hadn't learned a thing. She opened the door and said, "Come on in. I always told you your dad was a bum." And a few weeks later, she was in my court and said, "Start the support." Some months passed. Another quarrel in Mom's house, back to Dad's house. "Come on in. Maybe this time you'll believe me. Your mother's no good." Back to court. Stop the support. And a few months later, those two parents walked into my courtroom for the 4th time. And when they walked in that morning, I thought to myself, am I starting the support or am I stopping the support? I've lost track of where this child is. But what those two parents had to tell me that 4th morning was that neither of them knew where she was either. She'd run away. They had to hire a private investigator. It took 3 months to find that child. And when they found her on the streets of Los Angeles. She'd been making her way as a prostitute. They brought her back to Albuquerque, and she was committed to a psychiatric hospital here in town. And while she was in the hospital, they discovered that she tested HIV positive. That's AIDS. And then, and only then, did those two parents realize that they had to stop the fight, that they had to come up with a peaceful and civilized way to share what little was left of their daughter's life. Now, we have you in mediation because we want to help you learn how to share your children's lives before terrible things happen to them. I'd like you to imagine that you have 2 children. And I'd like you to imagine that I said to you, choose one of your children. You may have one, and the other one goes away. The other you'll never see again. I'm sure you'd say that's an impossible choice. There's a movie about this. You might want to have a look at it, but let me tell you the plot. The name of the movie is Sophie's Choice. Here's the way it goes. It's set in World War II, Nazi Germany. Sophie has a little boy and a little girl. Sophie and the children are taken to a Nazi prison camp. And when they get there, the Nazi soldiers say to Sophie, "Which one of these children do you want? Pick one." And Sophie said, "I can't choose between my children." And the soldier said, "Look, lady, if you don't pick one, you'll lose them both. So pick one." And so she picked one. And then the movie changes, and it's after the war, and Sophie's in America. And we see Sophie. Sophie is aimless and unproductive. She's pretty much useless to herself or anyone else. She's an alcoholic. And what the movie is about is the lifelong anguish that Sophie suffers from having been given that terrible choice. Now, I used to think that they set that movie in a Nazi prison camp because only a deranged Nazi would dream up such a plan. But I've come to realize that's not so, because I watch divorcing parents give their children Sophie's Choice all the time. When you quarrel and fight, what your children hear is, "Pick one. Which one of us do you want?" And I've seen the children who have been given Sophie's Choice. They do exactly what Sophie did. They self-destruct. It's important for you to know that your children see themselves as half of each of you. And they can't separate those two halves as you separated from one another. They're stuck. And when they hear one of you saying bad things about the other, they hear you saying bad things about half themselves. If they feel that one of you is angry with the other, they feel that you're angry with half themselves. If they sense that one of you hates the other, they feel that you hate half of them. Your children's biggest fear is that you're going to stop loving them and you're going to leave them. And they have pretty good data for that fear, don't they? They watched you leave each other. They know you're not quite dependable. Please remember, when you quarrel and fight, for your children, it's pick one. They can't survive if you give them that choice. I tell you about the cases I've seen in my court, and I tell you about Sophie's Choice because I don't know a better way to try to help you understand how important it is that you stop the fight. As a matter of fact, the work that you're about to begin in mediation is some of the most important work that any of you will ever do in your lives. And I have to level with you. It's some of the hardest work that any of you will ever do as well. We know that what we ask of you is hard, because we know that divorce brings with it every powerful negative emotion that we can think of. You have anger, fear, failure, guilt, rejection, all of those powerful feelings. And those are hard feelings to get hold of. You don't just look yourself in the mirror one day and say, "Well, I guess I won't be angry anymore." It doesn't work like that, and we know it. We know that the task before you is difficult. But we also know that it's doable. You just simply have to stop the fight. And we want to help you do that. Now, you're going to be dealing in mediation with a concept called joint custody. Joint custody is the law in New Mexico. Our legislature said so. And I want to tell you today, first of all, what joint custody is not. And then I'll tell you what it is. Joint custody does not mean equal time. It does not mean a week with dad and a week with mom. Now, equal time works for some children, but our statistics are very clear. Most children can't take it. It's too stressful. It's unsettling. They need a home base. Equal time is absolutely fair for parents, but it's rarely fair for children. This is one of those situations where your needs and your children's needs may be different. and we hope you'll put your children's needs first. Now, joint custody also does not mean equal financial responsibility. You can't have equal financial responsibility unless you have equal financial resources, and most of you don't. So joint custody is not equal time, and it's not equal money. Here's what it is. I'll quote the law for you. Joint custody means that neither parent may make a decision or take an action that results in a major change in a child's life until both parents agree or the court allows it. Let me put it for you in plain English. Joint custody means don't surprise each other. You don't like to be surprised by one another, I promise you. And it says no major changes. It doesn't mean that you have to talk about every dumb little thing. As a matter of fact, there are only 5 things that the law says you have to talk about, and here's what they are. The first one is residence. For most of the children I see, their residence is Albuquerque, New Mexico, and neither of you may change that until you agree or the court allows it. The second one is religion. Whatever religion you chose for your children when you were married making joint decisions, that's the same religion that they should continue to practice, and neither of you should change that. The third one is health care. The same doctor, the same dentist. We don't want 2 doctors who prescribe 2 drugs that don't go together. We don't want 2 dentists, one who says they need braces and the other who says they don't. You know what happens when you find those 2 dentists. You go off and hire 2 lawyers who charge more than $100 an hour, and you ask a judge to decide whether or not your children are to have braces. That doesn't make much sense. Of course, for us as judges, the decision's usually not too difficult, because by the time you're through paying your lawyers, there isn't any money left to pay for braces. The fourth one is school, the same school. Consistency. All children need consistency, but the children of divorced parents need it more than most. Now, I have to give you a little warning about school, because a lot of parents have their children in private schools when they're married, and because your money problems get so terrible when you divorce, well, private school is one of the first things that goes. But to the extent you can, keep them in the same schools. For the children who aren't in school, it's daycare. Daycare, that person who cares for them all day while you're at work. That's an important person. That person should never be aligned with one of you against the other. And that person ought not be changed frequently either. The fifth and last one is recreation. And we included recreation in our law because we'd had all these lawsuits about soccer. Here's the way they'd go. One of the parents would enroll the children in soccer without getting the other parent's agreement. And then when the children were with a parent who hadn't agreed, that parent wouldn't take them to the game. We had all these kids going to soccer practice Monday through Friday and missing the big game every other Saturday. That's not fair. But that's joint custody. Don't surprise each other. Now, the law says that there are 5 things that you have to talk about. There are other things that you should talk about. There's a golden rule of joint custody. Here's what it is. Before you do anything that involves your children, ask yourself, if the other parent did this without talking to me first, would I be upset? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it's one of those things that you should talk about. But joint custody, as we've defined it in the laws of New Mexico, in my opinion, is nothing more or less than just plain common sense. Now, most of you will spend most of your time in mediation talking about time. How do you share your children's time? And that's very difficult. That's a limited resource problem. There's not enough to go around. And you need to know that whatever time-sharing arrangement you come up with today or this week or this month, that time-sharing arrangement can't last forever. Your lives are going to change. And your children's lives are going to change. And your time-sharing arrangements will have to change as well. But this time-sharing problem is a perfect example of why divorce cases are so difficult to resolve. You know, most people come to my court with disagreements, and they always seem to think one of us is right and one of us is wrong, and the judge will figure out which is which. The judge will reward the one who's right and punish the one who's wrong. That's what the courts are all about in most people's minds, right and wrong, and that's what lawyers are trained to do. You know, the cases in which one person's right and the other one is wrong, they're really very easy for me to decide. But I only see 3 or 4 of them a year. Most of the cases I see, everyone is absolutely right. It's absolutely right for both parents to want custody of their children. And it's absolutely right for both of you to want to spend as much time with your children as possible. What could be wrong with that? And most of the time when one of you comes to me and says, I need more money, you're right, you do. And the other parent who comes and says, I can't afford to pay more money is often right, they can't. And one of the most difficult cases that I have to decide is when one of the parents wants to leave New Mexico and take the children. Those are really tough. Because most of the time, the parent who wants to leave has good reasons. They want to go home where their families are, and they want to take the children. They want to go where they have a better paying job. They want to go where their new spouse has been transferred. They need to take the children with them, and they're absolutely right. And the parent who's left behind says, wait a minute, I need to see the children, and they need to see me. I'd like to see them every day if I could. I certainly want to see them every week. And if you live in a different state, I can't do that. I need to see the children. They need to see me. And they're absolutely right. If you stop and think about most of your disagreements in divorce cases, if you genuinely think about them and try to view them from the other person's point of view, you'll discover that almost all of your disagreements are right, limited resource problems. I suspect some of you have seen cartoons where a judge is holding a coin under the bench and he's about to flip the coin to see who wins and who loses. Judges joke about flipping coins all the time. I'd like you to know that when you have a right problem, sometimes flipping a coin is as good a way as any to try to solve it. I happen to think it's better than hiring 2 lawyers who charge more than $100 an hour to try to prove who's righter. Because you know what the lawyers will try to do? They'll try to prove who's wronger, because that's what they've been trained to do. You know, you're involved in something called a lawsuit. I wish we didn't call it a lawsuit. I wish we called it anything else. Because when we call it a lawsuit, we give everyone the wrong mindset. Lawsuits are about winning and losing. Lawsuits are about all or nothing. Lawsuits are about something that happened in the past, that's over and done. And we're here in the present, and we have to figure out whose fault it was, who's responsible. You know, a car accident happened. Whose fault was it? A crime was committed. Who should be punished? And divorce cases are altogether different. In divorce, what happened in the past is pretty much irrelevant. We have no fault divorce. Fault has nothing to do with it. What divorce cases are all about, really, is planning the future. Planning how to stretch limited dollars to meet as many of your needs as possible. Planning how to share your children's limited time. You need to keep your eyes on the future, because that's what matters. And I need to give you a little warning about your lawyers. They aren't trained to plan the future, and some of them never learn how to do it. So you need to keep your lawyer's eyes on the future as well. And sometimes that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, I said when I started that I hoped when I'd finished that you would agree with me that mediation is a very important part of your divorce process. Let me repeat for you what our goals for you are. We want to help you learn that your children need and love both of you. We want to help you learn how to share your children's lives in a peaceful and civilized way. We want to help you learn that your children's needs can be different from yours, and when they are, your children's needs should come first. We want to help you learn how to resolve conflict. Right conflict, and you will have right conflict. We want to help you learn how to resolve conflict in a peaceful and civilized way. And we want to help you learn how to keep judges and lawyers out of your lives, because we haven't any business there. How many of you love your children? I'm sure that each and every one of you truly does. Please remember, judges and lawyers do not love your children. The two of you are the ones who love them, and the two of you are the ones who should decide how they'll grow up. I wish you all success. I don't want to leave you with the impression that I believe that all lawyers make things worse. That is not what I believe, and that is not so. In fact, many lawyers are peacemakers. They work hard to help you stop the fight, and they earn their fees. If, however, one or both of you insists on continuing the fight will continue, even if your lawyers were the most skillful peacemakers on earth. It's the fight that's expensive.